Hello, I want to thank you everyone who has joined the summit. Now we have our next speaker, Justin Holz. Justin is a PhD candidate at the Harris School for Public Policy at the University of Chicago. He is also an affiliated researcher at the Joint Initiative for Latin America Experimental Economics, and his studies focus on labor market, the policy use of force, and tax compliance. I would also like to thank Professor John List, who is involved with the 100 million nudge study as well. Please welcome Justin.
Hello. Let me share my screens. All right, can you guys see my slides? Okay, great.
Yes, we can see it.
You can? Great. Okay. All right, so this talk today is called the $100 million Nudge, Increasing Tax Compliances of Businesses and Self-Employed Using a Natural Field Experiment. This is joint work with John List at the Economics Department, Alejandro Zentner at UT Dallas, along with Marvin Cardoza and Joaquin Zentner. So as sort of motivation for this project, fiscal capacity has been shown to be incredibly important for economic development. So government needs tax money if they want to protect law and order, if they want to protect property rights, if they want to regulate markets, provide public goods, etc. And developing countries traditionally have struggled with collecting large amounts of tax revenue, and mainly this comes through higher levels of evasion that occur in these countries. So tax evasion can affect both the equity and the efficiency of taxation. It affects the efficiency through increasing the cost of raising an additional dollar, and it can affect equity through changing the distribution of the tax burden. And so for these reasons, improving tax compliance has been a core direct development objective in countries around the world. And that's no different in the setting that we're studying today. So today we're going to be looking at some experiments that occurred in the Dominican Republic. And this country has long struggled with tax evasion. The IRS in the Dominican Republic sort of estimates that self-employed workers evade about 57% of taxes and firms evade about 62% of taxes. And this translates to a tax to GDP ratio that's lower than most OECD countries. So the tax to GDP ratio in the Dominican Republic is about 13% compared to about 34% in OECD countries. In 2018, the Dominican Republic passed a new law that was meant to increase the fiscal capacity of the country through increasing the penalties for tax evasion. And then they approached us to, so that we could employ some nudges to try to increase the efficacy of this law. So the law was called the Law 15517 against money laundering and terrorism financing. And while the law was primarily against money laundering and terrorist financing, the law included included tax evasion to a list of offenses that could now be penalized with criminal punishment. So specifically, if you were caught evading your taxes, you could be punished with 3 or more years in prison and also face stiff monetary fines. And so the question that we're going to ask in this paper is whether the government can use deterrence nudges in conjunction with this law to increase tax revenue. What we're going to do is we're going to send 84,000 messages to self-employed workers and firms who collectively paid about $800 million in the year before the experiment. And then because we're going to be looking at income tax declarations, we're not going to know how much money companies actually owe. Instead, we're going to observe income declarations and taxes paid using the administrative tax data. And we're going to infer the amount of evasion that was happening by comparing the amount of taxes raised in the treatment groups relative to a control group. And the control group is going to be a simple reminder message that just tells people about the upcoming tax date. And the reason that we use this as the control group is because there's been some other work that suggests that just the act of reminding people about tax dates can increase tax compliance. And so in light of that, you might view our treatment effects as smaller than they would have been had we used a control group with no message at all. So we're going to use 3 different types of messages. The first is going to be a public disclosure message. So essentially, we're going to tell people that if they evade their taxes and they're caught evading taxes, the punishment that they receive for this is going to be made public knowledge. And that might affect tax compliance through one of 2 different channels. So it might be that subjects in the experiment get social image utility, and that just means that they get some utility out of the act of being held in high esteem by their peers. or it might be that they get instrumental benefits from acting responsibly. So there's some literature in the corporate social responsibility literature that suggests that companies who act with responsible practices can attract more productive workers and sell their goods for higher prices. And so by disclosing malfeasance through tax evasion, firms and self-employed workers might be damaged, and therefore they might want to pay more taxes. There's been some work recently that suggests that this kind of shaming can increase tax compliance. So there's been papers that show that individuals increase tax compliance when the public disclosure of their tax evasion is revealed. And there's been some naturally occurring data and observational research that suggests firms also respond to this kind of shaming. However, we're going to be the first experiment that shows that firms respond to this kind of shaming. The next is we're going to highlight the new prison sentence that is added to the law. And the way that we're going to do this is just by mentioning that this prison sentence is a possible punishment for tax evasion. And so quite simply, that should just increase the expected cost of evading taxes. And therefore, it should also increase tax revenues. It's important to note, though, that because prison is a very public punishment, we also should expect that the prison time treatment may also trigger some social image or reputational concerns. And therefore, we might want to view the prison treatment as the public disclosure plus another kind of deterrence. And last, what we're going to do is we're going to reframe the messages as viewing evading taxes as an active choice rather than an active omission. So there's been some work in the UK and Belgium that shows that if you change the framing of tax evasion from an active omission, so you're evading by mistake, to an active choice, so you're choosing to evade, that can affect tax compliance. In the UK, they found that if you reframe evasion of known tax debt as an active choice, that it's going to double the amount of taxes that people pay. But the paper in Belgium found that there is no real effect of this nudge. So overall, we're going to present three main results. The first is that the treatments increase tax revenue by about $192 million. So this is going to be 0.25% of the country's pre-experiment GDP. About $100 million of this is going to be revenue that the government wouldn't have gotten absent the experiment. And the lion's share of this is raised by the prison treatments. We're also going to show you that the commission frame is only effective when combined with the prison's deterrence message. So when we add the prison frame to the control group, or when we add it to the public disclosure treatment, there's no effect on the amount of taxes raised. But when we add the commission frame to the prison message, then we double the amount of taxes that are raised. The final result is that the largest firms in the market are going to be the most likely to respond to our treatments. And this is important because most papers that examine the effect of nudges on tax compliance are going to focus primarily on small and medium-sized workers. But in our setting, and the same in many other settings, the top 20% of firms are going to pay over 80% of all tax revenue. So understanding how nudges affect the largest players in the market is going to be incredibly important for policy reasons. And we're going to show that they respond even more strongly to the treatments than smaller firms. We're going to view the paper as having three contributions. The first is that we show that deterrence nudges, like the ones we use, can substantially increase tax compliance. And this builds on a large literature that uses deterrence nudges to increase tax compliance. And we're going to show that the effects of the commission frame depend heavily on the perceived punishment regime. So this might reconcile why the commission frame was effective in the UK, but not effective in Belgium. If people believe that there were different punishment regimes, that's going to mediate the treatment effects. And third, the government should focus more on using nudges for the largest firms in the market, because there may be a lot of untapped potential through experimenting with those firms. Okay, so in terms of the experiment, there's going to be two experiments that each use different types of workers, or different types of subjects. So there's going to be an experiment that used self-employed subjects. So this is going to be 28,000 self-employed workers who filed taxes in fiscal year 2018. And you can see that they paid the lion's share of the taxes for the total population. So all in all, there's about 60,000 self-employed workers in the country. We're going to experiment on about 28,000 of them. And the ones that we experiment on are going to be a little bit larger than the ones that we don't experiment on. All in all, the income tax paid by self-employed workers is about 1% of total tax revenue. And for firms, we're going to experiment on about 58,000 of the 168,000 total firms in the economy. These are going to be larger than the firms that we don't experiment on, although we're going to observe firms through the whole distribution of firm size. Not to pay taxes, we're going to intervene and send them nudges through email and through its virtual office. And then after these nudges are received, firms are going to decide, and self-employed workers are going to decide when to file taxes and whether to file taxes. Because the messages are sent right before the tax date, we can assume that true values of the inputs, so of how much money they earned in the previous year, is uncorrelated with the treatment assignments through randomization. And therefore, any differences in their choices can be interpreted as changes in tax evasion. And so after they file taxes, they're going to declare their gross income. So this is going to be the amount of revenue that they earned in the previous year. They're going to take whatever taxable deductions they think they deserve, and then they're going to determine their taxable income, which is just going to be their gross income minus deductions. And that's going to determine the tax bill that they have to pay. And then they're going to be at risk of what we're calling automatic desk audits and probabilistic audits. So the automatic desk audits are going to be the IRS is going to see something peculiar on the tax form, and then they're going to send a message to the company asking them what the discrepancy is. And then the probabilistic audits are going to be more detailed, where they actually go into the firm and figure out what causes the discrepancies that they see. The way that the tax bracket works is going to be different for firms and self-employed individuals. So if you're a firm and your net income, so that's gross income minus deductions, is less than $0, then you're going to be exempt from paying any taxes. And then if you earn any positive net income, you're going to be charged 27% of that net income, no matter how much money you earn. If you're a self-employed worker, you're not going to have to pay any taxes on the first $8,300 that you earn. And then after that, you're going to face an increasing marginal tax rate. The audits are going to be sort of rare. So the probability that a person receives like an automatic audit, this is a message from the IRS, is about 8%, or firms at 6%. But the probability that a self-employed worker or a firm receives a full audit is going to be a fraction of 1%. Yeah, I guess that's all I want to say about that. Okay. So in terms of the sample sizes, we run 2 experiments. So for firms, we're going to have a total sample size of about 56,000. We're going to split those evenly across the different treatments we have. So the treatments are going to be the reminder message. We're going to reframe tax compliance as an active choice rather than a mistake. The public disclosure, we're going to do public disclosure with the commission frame, and then prison with the commission frame. For the self-employed workers, we're again going to split the sample evenly across the 6 treatments, with a total of about 28,000 total people in the experiment, or 4,700 in each treatment. The messages are going to look like this. They're going to come both through the email that the subjects receive and also to their virtual office. So the virtual office is going to be an online website that people can log into to pay their taxes. The messages are going to be sent to the self-employed workers 3 days before the tax deadline. And the messages are sent to firms twice, once 30 days before the tax deadline and once 15 days before the tax deadline. The text of the message is going to look like this. So in the control group, we're going to say, we remind you that the deadline of the obligation of filing and paying the individual income tax on the fiscal year that we ran the experiment is on the tax date. And so this is going to be April 1st for self-employed workers and April 30th for firms. And then if they're in the public treatment, they're going to get the control message. And they're also going to get another paragraph that says, bear in mind that providing inaccurate information in the tax return could be considered a violation of the provisions of the new law against money laundering and terrorism financing, and that specifics of the imposed punishment would be public information available to the whole population once the ruling is final. So we're telling people that if they get caught evading taxes, that this is going to be public information. However, you could view this sort of as a weaker public nudge than the nudges that are used in a lot of other experiments, because we're not going to have an active shame list that people can go to and look up who evaded. They're going to have to find that information through themselves, although it will be public information. And then the prison message says, Bear in mind that as established by the new law against money laundering and terrorism financing, providing inaccurate information in the tax return could be punished with a prison sentence. Then, if they're in the commission with public, or commission with prison treatments, we're also going to tell them that bear in mind that providing inaccurate information in the tax return might not be considered as an oversight, but as a voluntary choice, which would represent a violation of your obligations as a taxpayer as established by the Articles 253 and 254 of the tax code. So this also could be viewed as a slightly weaker version of the commission frame that's been used in previous experiments, because we're not telling people that for sure their inaccurate information will be viewed as a voluntary choice, just that it might be viewed as a voluntary choice. So in terms of the empirical strategy, we're essentially going to use difference and differences. So we have randomization that allows us to infer differences between treatment groups as a treatment effect, and then we're going to compare this to the behavior of the groups in the previous fiscal year. So here what I'm showing you is the change in the net taxes paid from the year before the experiment to the year of the experiment for the control group and the treatment messages. So the first thing that you can see is that in the control group, the amount of taxes paid by these subjects decreased by about $1,000, while in the treatment messages, if we pull them all together, the amount of taxes raised per subject increased by about $2,000, which was a $3,000 treatment effect when you compare it to the control group. And so for all of the estimates that I show you going forward, estimates are going to be relative to the control group. So they're going to be relative to this decrease that the people in the control group experienced. So the first thing I want to show you is the intent to treat effects of the messages on taxes paid by all subjects. So here we're pooling the effects for both self-employed workers and firms. And what you can see is that the commission frame by itself really had no effect on taxes paid. The public disclosure message increased taxes paid by about $2,000. The public disclosure message with commission is about the same as the public message, suggesting that the commission frame didn't enhance the effect of the public message at all. The prison message is about twice as effective as the public disclosure message. And then when we add the commission frame to the prison message, it doubles the effectiveness, increasing the amount of taxes paid by subjects by about $7,500 per subject. And if we add up all this money together, we raised about $192 million more in the treatment groups than the control group. Okay, so if we look at these effects across the different types of experiments, we can see that the relationships are qualitatively similar. The public disclosure group in the self-employed treatment is very noisy. However, the effects are sort of comparable with the prison and the prison with commission treatment. For firms, the public disclosure treatment is effective. The prison message is about twice as effective. And then the prison with commission treatment is about twice as effective as the prison without commission. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is we want to look at what behavioral changes led to the increase in taxes paid. So if you remember, taxes paid goes through this process where first they decide whether to file, next they decide how much gross revenue to report, next they decide how many deductions to take, which determines their net revenue, and then how many taxes to pay. And so a lot of these results are in the paper if you're interested. What we find is that neither type of taxpayer changes their probability of filing taxes, that self-employed workers increase their declarations of net revenue, but not their gross revenue, while firms increase their declarations of gross revenue, net revenue, and also greatly reduce the probability of declaring exempt levels of net revenue. So what I mean by that can be seen in this graph. So here what I'm plotting is the probability of declaring an exempt level of income separately for self-employed workers and firms. So for example, self-employed workers, about 65% of self-employed workers declare income below $8,300 and therefore have to pay no taxes on their income. This is slightly reduced in each of the treatment groups. If we look at firms, on the other hand, about 70% of firms are reporting negative net revenue. So that is, they are paying zero taxes whatsoever. In all four of the deterrence messages that we use, we decrease the probability of declaring an exempt level of income by about 20 percentage points. So about 50% of firms in each of the treatment groups declare negative net revenue compared to 70% in the control group. Okay. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to understand whether treatments increase total revenue or just accelerate total revenue. So what I mean by this is that if firms were going to audit the people who are evading taxes anyways, then any additional revenue that we raise from the experiment may just have come to the government faster than they would have gotten after the audits. However, we should say that additional revenue, accelerated revenue is still valuable to the government because they get that money sooner, and so they can use the money sooner. And the way that we're gonna break this down is we're gonna use information about audits that occurred after the experiment. And so what we're gonna say is that revenue is gonna be considered accelerated if it's raised from subjects who are eventually audited by the government. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna say that if the IRS never audits a subject, that means that the amount of extra money that we have raised from those subjects is money the government never would have gotten without the experiment. If the IRS sends them an automatic desk audit, we're going to say that the IRS is going to recover some of the money from those subjects. And if the IRS chooses to use a full audit against the subjects, the IRS is going to recover all of the money that we got from the experiment from the subject. So if we break this down into the three different parts, we find that $104 million was raised by subjects who never get an audit after the experiment. And so this can be attributed to the experiment. This is money that the government would not have gotten without running it. $43 million was raised by subjects receiving an automatic audit. So some of this money would have gone to the government through changes in the tax form that are filled out after the audit occurs. And about 45 million are raised by subjects receiving a full audit. So this is money the government would have gotten anyways, even without the experiment. Okay, so the next thing that I want to look at is heterogeneity by firm size. So I had mentioned this before, but an important feature of the economy is that the largest firms are going to pay a disproportionate fraction of the total revenue. And so here, the top 20% of firms by size pay 80% of all tax revenue in the country. And so it's important to understand how nudges are going to affect the largest players in the market if we want to roll out these nudges at scale. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at heterogeneity and the effectiveness of nudges by the amount of workers that work at the firm. And so you might imagine that tax evasion could be higher or lower in these largest firms, and then therefore treatment effects might be higher or larger. The past research sort of suggests that tax evasion might be lower in large firms relative to small firms, because the more workers work at a firm, the more likely it is that somebody's going to blow the whistle and report tax evasion to the IRS. And there's some empirical work that shows that if you send nudges to firms that increase the probability that increase their perception of the probability that they're going to be audited, that smaller firms are going to respond more than larger firms. However, there may also be fixed costs to evasion. So you may have to develop some infrastructure to allow you to evade, or some technology to allow you to evade. And there may also be a higher perceived detection probability for larger firms. And so changes in the perceived punishments may mean more to them. So if I just show you the data for what people look like across the firm size distribution, you can see that the majority of firms, the vast majority of firms, have only a single employee. And then the first quintile of firms has about 2.4 employees, about 4 in the second quintile, 6 in the third quintile, 11 on average in the fourth quintile, and about 100 on average in the fifth quintile, although we observe firms that are much larger than that, in the thousands of employees. You can also see that the fifth quintile of firm size is going to be declaring gross revenue that's an order of magnitude bigger than the gross income paid by the fourth or lower quintile. That the amount of taxable income that they report is also going to be an order of magnitude higher than the fourth quintile. They're also going to be less likely to declare exempt levels of taxes, and they're going to pay a lot more taxes than the other 4 quintiles. So here what I'm going to show you is the probability of paying more taxes in the year after the experiment relative to the year before the experiment, broken up by treatment group. So you can see that for one employee, that the treatment effects are pretty modest in terms of increasing the probability of paying taxes. And then for the first through fifth quintile, you can see that the control group, which is represented by this black circle, has about the same probability of increasing taxes paid, regardless of the quintile. And you can see that the commission treatment also didn't have much effect across the quintile. So these are relatively constant. However, in contrast, you can see that the effect of the treatments is increasing with firm size. So the probability of paying more taxes in the year after the experiment relative to the year before the experiment is going to be largest for the firms in this fifth quintile, especially when compared to firms in the first and second quintile. You can also see that as we get to the fourth and fifth quintile, the prison with commission treatment is really the treatment that's changing the behavior of these largest firms, although every one of the deterrence message treatments are increasing compliance relative to the control group. If we want to look at this in terms of total dollars raised, because that's going to be what the government cares about, you can see that the amount of additional income raised by the firms in this fifth quintile just dwarfs everything that was raised by the firms with one employee or those with the first or fourth quintile. So again, the prison with commission message is going to be the most effective, raising the largest amount of money for those in this part of the distribution. Okay. So in conclusion, deterrence nudges are going to be able to substantially increase tax compliance. The commission frame is going to depend greatly on the punishment. So we saw that the commission frame did nothing with the control message alone or with the public disclosure message. However, it doubled the efficacy of the prison message. And so maybe we don't want to throw out the idea that this commission frame can be really effective. It's just going to depend on the underlying punishment that subjects perceive in your experiment. We also find that nudges can induce the largest firms to pay more taxes. And we can conclude from that governments may be leaving money on the table when only nudging small and medium-sized firms or individuals. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin. That was very good, very insightful, and I think it's very interesting to see how it affects the large firms more than the small firms. I see some studies, they only focus on the small firms. So I quite like your last phrase of that the government might be leaving money on the table. Thank you very much for that. And now we'll move to the Q&A session. And I can see we have one question here already.
Increase tax compliance. I think that it's likely that the prison message will work in other countries that have that as a punishment. Although I think it's relatively rare that countries have this kind of a harsh punishment for tax evasion. And so obviously the nudge wouldn't work in places that don't have this, but there's a large body of work that shows that deterrence messages can increase tax compliance in a bunch of countries. So I think that it's likely that any country that has similar types of laws will experience similar types of effects.
Thank you. We have a second question. Would nudging big companies indirectly influence smaller ones?
Yeah, so that's definitely possible, especially with something like the public disclosure treatment. If it's revealed that the largest companies evaded taxes and they're being punished for it, you can imagine that's going to be very high profile, and that might be effective at changing the norms or the perception of realizing punishments that small firms realize.
Thank you very much for that. Now I'll move it to Anya. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think those are all the questions that we have received. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I think we'll end the session now.
Great.